Last time around when I reviewed an e-bike here in Beards and Bikes, it was a bit different to this one. It was a combination of on and off-road, being more of a mountain bike style, whereas this is more of a commuter in the, say, £500 region. And these days, if you live in a city, particularly here in the UK, of course, with congestion charges, ultra-low emission zones, it makes a lot more sense to have something like an e-bike, even if you never plan to use it as a bicycle and just use it essentially as a budget scooter or a budget motorcycle. That is essentially what you can do. And one of the things which I'll do here in the video, in addition to seeing essentially the unboxing in terms of how the bike comes, or the additional bits that you can fit to it, I didn't bother recording the actual process of putting it together, but suffice it to say you can use the book, which again I'll show you footage of. You can see the specs of the bike therein, the warranty information, etc. And in terms of putting it together, I would set aside maybe an evening, and you'll more often than not have at least some charge in the battery to give it a quick try. It takes about 6 hours or so to charge it up. The battery, incidentally, is a 36 volt with about 13 amp hours and a 250 watt in terms of actual performance and torque, etc. Now, performance-wise, you're looking at 25 kilometers an hour flat out. That's more than quick enough, I would say, for a city setting. You don't want to be going too quick through city streets and crash into something, but it's quick enough to make an otherwise longer journey feel like it takes about 5 or 10 minutes. So I would say that's more than quick enough. The bike weighs 27 kilos fully assembled, so I guess you'll have to decide for yourself if you consider that to be within the parameters that you would want. And in terms of how I personally spec the bike, you'll see in the walk around, it does look a little bit different to some of the images you'll see online. So for example, I didn't bother fitting the carrying cages because I had no use for those, so why waste the aerodynamics and add the extra weight if you're not going to use the carry cage? It's a very simple affair to bolt it onto the bike though, and of course all of that stuff comes with it. And the one thing which I actually removed from the bike was the mud flap. And even though their purpose is pretty obvious and sometimes necessary, certainly off-road, I just don't really trust them. I kind of have this semi-founded fear, if you will, of the mud flap folding over on itself and getting stuck in the wheel, so I just don't bother with it. And even after taking the bike out with no mud guards on there and just normal t-shirt which would have showed up the dirt, nothing. I rode the bike for a total of around 13 kilometers in a couple of different runs, and as I said, I stuck to the road side of things because it's not exactly an off-roader in this form. Speaking to the most important thing, which is of course stuff like range and battery life, well, the charge time is about 6 hours. You can charge it either with the battery attached to the bike, or if you want to, for example, keep the bike in the garage and then charge the battery in your house, whatever your circumstance may be, you can completely remove it. You can clip forward the seat, slide out the battery and plug it straight into the wall. It doesn't necessarily have like a charge timer, so I guess you would need to pay attention to how long you've had it on charge for based on how low the light was to begin with. It has a key system to arm the battery, if you will, to be able to actually use it. You can turn it off while it's still in the bike, or you can completely unlock it to allow it to be removed. And to return to the ever important topic of range, as I said, I covered about 13 kilometers on the bike. It already had some charge. I charged it up a bit more. I wouldn't necessarily say it was probably 100%. It was on 5 out of 5 bars, but it's hard to know if it was actually full or not, which I guess you could say is a bit of a demerit, but if you do it based on time, you'll be okay. I would assume it probably had maybe at least 80-90% battery, I would assume. So running on that kind of logic, we went down to about halfway, partially pedaling. A lot of the time I was just relying on the throttle. So in other words, if it wasn't fully charged, I went from less than full to about halfway, so maybe, I don't know, 40% or so of the battery to go about 13 kilometers. And that's with me as a bigger rider. I weigh about 85-90 kilos or so. The bike has a maximum operating weight of 120 kilos as far as the rider goes. With a bigger, heavier rider, I'm less aerodynamic as well, and as silly as it sounds, you do have to factor that in. So I would say that's actually not bad at all. And even though you could get caught up in, well, if it says it should do 75 kilometers, well, you have to remember there's temperatures involved, weights involved, uphill, downhill, all that kind of stuff. And also, it's somewhere between 45 and 75 kilometers. I'm not saying this to excuse a bike necessarily not meeting numbers. The point that I'm making is more so, how often are you actually going to be riding a bike 40 kilometers to your work commute? Maybe some people do, but I highly doubt that most people are. So what really matters, of course, is the time between charges. So ride to work, leave the bike at work, ride it back again, maybe take an extra ride out somewhere to pick up something, and ideally you wouldn't want to have to do multiple charges between those time periods. If you're doing at least 40 kilometers, or let's say worst case scenario, in my case, 13 kilometers, let's say it had used half of the battery, well, that's about 25-26 kilometers overall then. Well, again, around 25-26 kilometers, I wouldn't say that's too bad in terms of range. And clearly it's actually more than that, because the majority of the time I was running close, if not at, top speed of around 25 kilometers per hour. I would imagine that for most potential buyers, the second most important thing after battery life is probably, is it comfortable? What's the riding position like? What's the seat like? What does it feel like if you are going to do a longer distance, maybe in and out of traffic, maybe sitting around, whatever the case may be? Well, that one I will definitely give the bike top marks for. I love the seating position. For me, as a taller rider, it's still perfect. You can adjust the seat anyway. The seat is sprung and you can adjust it up and down, as well as I said, of course, tilting it forward to get the battery out. Of course, being a step-through bike makes getting on and off of it a lot easier. Maybe if you're a bit older and maybe your joints aren't quite as good and that's why you want the electric assist. And actually, my two favourite things about the bike from an ergonomic perspective are, number one, the seat. It is very comfortable. And for me, I definitely do notice that. Of course, being, again, a bigger guy, a heavier guy, when I'm on a bike, I do notice if the seat is painful, and I'll notice pretty quick. On this bike, I could have ridden it 2-3 hours probably and wouldn't have felt anything. For me, both occasions when I rode this bike, I felt perfectly fine getting off of it. It was completely comfortable. Actually, possibly the single most comfortable ride I've had on a bicycle, which is kind of saying something. The second thing I really liked about the ergonomics, though, was actually the handlebar setup. Not only where everything is and how easy it is to get to, from the thumb-operated throttle, which incidentally I think that's a good touch. When you have a twist grip throttle, which is what I had last time on that other review, it's fun to use that and have that motorcycle style, but I think it's actually better for safety, especially if you think about it, there'll be people who ride these who maybe have never ridden a motorcycle, but for those people they need to be able to roll off the throttle, as it were, and slow down quick without accidentally fully opening up the bike and going really quick. So having thumb operated means that if you really do grab for that front brake, your thumb will have to come off the throttle to do that. So I like that as a safety touch. In general though, I just love the handlebars. I love the shape of it. It's very motorcycle-esque, kind of like a cruiser. And again, it is that kind of bike, so that would make sense. I like the colour coding with the handles and the seat, the colour of the frame with the seat and the handlebars. It's just a clean, classy looking, simple design. And I like that they keep the wiring away inside the frame while simultaneously not having a ridiculously oversized frame to fit all of that wiring inside, and certainly not overly heavy either. In terms of suspension, well, it's nothing too fancy there. There's no suspension on the rear, and it has relatively simple looking forks on the front. Again, it's a cruiser. You're not going to be making jumps, chances are, on this bike or taking it off-road. You do, however, have to account for stuff like potholes, curbs, even in a city. So how does it handle that kind of stuff? The seat is doing so much heavy lifting there, quite literally, that the suspension almost feels like it doesn't matter. I didn't notice much travel on the springs, to be honest, on the front, so the seat was just so comfortable that it felt like it was doing all of the comfort work to the point where the suspension was kind of irrelevant, which is a great sign. Even at this price point, that's not to say I didn't have one or two, not even issues, but more small gripes with the bike. For me, there were two things which stood out, and you'll kind of see the fact that I've removed something here or there. The first one I already mentioned, which is the mud flaps. That I'm not really going to hold against this bike though, because as I said, I'm never a fan of those. In the case of those mud guards, like I said, that's not a knock against this bike. I have to mention it. The one thing to bear in mind about the mud guards though is that one particular screw that you put through to keep the mud guard on runs extremely close to the gears, and I actually found that if you want it completely tightened in, it will be rubbing against the gear, so you have to loosen it off a little bit, but then when you do loosen it off a bit, it doesn't feel quite as tight and quite as secure in place. But like I said, even if it wasn't doing that, I'd have taken them off anyway. And to interject another positive thing about the bike before we jump into the other drawback, I actually really like the light setup on the front. It's already basically done for you. You just screw it on, it's already wired in, and I love the fact that it actually has its own dedicated button. It's a very powerful LED to the point where I went out of my way to angle it way down so I wasn't blinding drivers or at least annoying them. But yeah, it's good to know that you definitely will be seen on this bike. To return to the other gripe though, this is the only one which for me I would say is a justified gripe, because unless I'm really missing something here, the kickstand just kind of doesn't work. Now, for full exposure, I haven't watched anyone else's reviews. I've seen that there are some other reviews for this bike out there, but I never like to be influenced by other people when it comes to cars, bikes, whatever. This might have been mentioned by other people, but for me, the kickstand just doesn't work. And it doesn't work because of the angle that it's on. I tried to take it off and see if I'd maybe fitted it wrong, maybe flip it the other way around. You literally cannot fit it any other way. So the only way that the kickstand will fit means that when you fold it out, the angle is so high that it's trying to keep the bike almost completely upright. And anyone who knows bikes, motorcycles or bicycles knows that just doesn't work. The bike has to be slightly leaned over for a kickstand to work in the first place. This one is trying to keep the bike so upright, and it almost feels like the stand is too long, like it's for the wrong bike, and it meant that it just didn't work. It would either fall the other way, or it just wouldn't stand up properly and it would roll forward and fall over. So in my case, I just took it off completely. Same thing with the mud flaps and the cages. Don't need them, so didn't have them there. Now even then, if you keep the bike at work, chances are you're probably going to have it locked up somewhere, usually next to a bike rail. If you've got it at home, you'll probably have it indoors somewhere, presumably with the battery pack at least, or in a garage. So 9 times out of 10, I wouldn't say the kickstand feels entirely necessary, and in most places, you're going to lean the bike against a wall or whatever anyway. So I wouldn't say it's a deal breaker for me, but since it was technically a drawback, I wouldn't feel right not mentioning it. All things considered though, if that's the biggest nitpick I can bring up, that's not bad for the rest of the bike. I actually think this is a very impressive bit of kit. The two things which impressed me the most about it were definitely how good the range seems to be. The battery size is very good and the weight of it is very good in terms of not being ridiculously big, but certainly giving you plenty of range at even a decent speed, and I rode it the entire time on maximum power. So if it was going to drain the battery quick, it would have, because I had it on that level. So of course that will make a difference to the range as well. And at the end of the day, for that price point, well, you're not really going to get any kind of electric motorcycle or electric moped for anywhere near £500, and that's brand new, around $550 even if you buy it directly from iScooter. So not bad at all in terms of value. I would say if you are looking on the market for that kind of budget, for a commuter in particular, but with, I would say, a pretty ergonomically pleasing setup in terms of handlebar position, seat position, comfort level, ride quality, and just the overall packaging, it feels like thought did go into it. It's clean, it's classy looking, and it kind of just works. It almost reminds me of like a Toyota if it were an e-bike. It just gets the job done, and that can't be a bad thing. Ultimately though, that's it for my thoughts on the U2, and of course it wasn't a comparison test either, as you will have realised by now, so check out those on YouTube if you are interested in how it compares. That's it ultimately for my thoughts though on the U2. I hope this has helped you either way in terms of making a decision on an e-bike. Of course, check out my other review and perhaps more in future as well, you never know, and for now, thanks for watching.